Hey there, Nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and we're back in an episode of Cheap Shots, the series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you guys how to paint the Dread Pageant for your games of Warhammer Underworlds both quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. By following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, we can paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $32. Then when compared with materials that you need to purchase from Army Painter and Citadel, we'll help you save over $184 at the same time. So that being said, let's go and talk about exactly how to quickly and, more importantly, cheaply paint up the Dread Pageant. So the very first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures and then to prime your miniatures. And this is actually going to be very simple for you to do because the Warhammer Underworld warbands are all push-fit type of construction, so you just assemble your miniatures accordingly. And then, of course, once you do have them assembled, the first thing you gotta do, of course, is to prime them. In this case, we're going to use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. You can get this at your local Walmart for about $3.99. And I like using this product because it's extremely cheap and it does the job effectively well. What priming actually does, it creates a uneven textured surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to paint your miniatures using acrylic paints on putting it on bare plastic, there's not enough surface tension to actually keep the acrylic paint adhered to your guys' miniatures. So if you do the slightest bit of friction, it'll just rub off your miniature and ruin your overall finish. And so that's exactly why we prime miniatures. The second thing that priming miniatures also does as well is it actually has a really big impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you use. Traditionally speaking, if you're using a very bright or bold color setup, you want to use a white primer. And if you're going for something a little bit darker or more mysterious, you go with a black primer. And they do have a very huge impact on the vibrancy of those colors. So once you guys have your miniatures assembled and primed, the next thing you got to do, of course, is start working on the flesh. So a lot of flesh is exposed on these miniatures, so I decided to break them up into three different color groups for their flesh tones. I decided for the fighter, this Arm of the Spear, to go with a darker flesh tone, so I used 2 thin coats of Nutmeg Brown by Apple Barrel Paint. As for the leader as well as the archer, I decided to use normal colored flesh from Apple Barrel Paint. And then for the giant Slangor that's a part of the unit, I decided to use Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. Now the 2 Apple Barrel Paints you can get from your local Walmart for about 50 cents, while the Delta Serum Coat is 65 cents at your local Hobby Lobby. Just put 2 thin coats on all the flesh that is exposed, and you pretty much have a good base to work off of. You don't need to be particularly neat at this point, and the reason why is because there is nothing else on these miniatures, and plus as you add on those successive layers of details on these miniatures, you can neaten up afterwards. Now that we're done completely base coating the flesh, the next thing we do, of course, is a dry brush. Now, dry brushing is a beautiful painting technique that does an excellent job of actually creating highlights on your miniatures and creating the illusion of depth on your miniatures as well. And the reason why that is the case is because the pigments of the paint actually adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while leaving that darker base coat in the recesses. So because this, we use three different colors for this. For the Slangor, because of that paler flesh tone that we used earlier, we're going to use Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint. For the 2 fighters in the middle that we actually did in a flesh tone before, we're going to use Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat, and for the fighter that we have for the spear, we're going to use Apple Barrel Flesh in order to do the dry brushing on this. Just do a quick dry brushing directly onto the miniature, and as you can see, that lighter color has risen to the spray surface, while the darker base coats are still in the recess of the miniature, creating that illusion of depth as well as texturing. Now, I will warn you that if you do decide to do a dry brushing on your miniature, it does have this very powdery kind of chalky texture afterwards. Don't worry about that, because what we're going to do is we're going to do an oil wash directly afterwards, and that's going to smooth out that transition. So the next feature we're going to work on are all the black leather goods that these characters are wearing. And as you can see, they're actually wearing quite a bit. And the reason why is because these characters are Slaanesh, so they do have this kind of like S&M leather type of motif going on with their clothing. These guys are wearing like things like corsets, for example, stockings, arm warmers, weird bands of belts and all kinds of different things, masks, all kinds of stuff. So because of what we're going to do is we're going to pick out all those details in 2 thin layer of pavement. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. It's made by Apple Barrel. It's a beautiful dark color. It's basically a dark gray, almost a black color. But the reason why I like using pigment so much is not necessarily the color, but the reason why I like using it is because it does have a little bit of a grainy texture to the paint when you add it to your miniature, and I love that because when you do dry brushing, it does a really good job of adhering those pigments in order to create that illusion of depth on your miniatures. You can see this in the next example that we have here as well. As you can see, I just used some pewter gray by Apple Barrel Paint. It costs 50 cents at my local Walmart, and as you can see, it kind of adheres to the leather goods that we did earlier. You can see a lot of things like the laces of the boots, for example, the leader, as well as the folds of the fabric and the texturing of the fabric that these characters are wearing. And once we get done with that dry brush, we're going to do one additional highlight on top of that, and then we'll be done with all the black leather. That last color we're going to use is Pale Gray by Folk Art. It's a nice bright gray, almost like an off-white color. We just do a really quick dry brush all over the entirety of the miniatures that we did in black before. And the reason why I do this is to add one additional highlight to the miniatures as well. You can see like things like the individual rivets of the leather goods that these guys are wearing as well. Things like the texturing on the corsets along their arm greaves, the grips of their weapons, etc. So once we get done with that dry brushing using that Folk Art, the next thing we're going to work on are all the shades of purple on the clothing that these characters are wearing. So once again, this is a Slaanesh dedicated warband, so because we're going to use a bunch of different colors in order to pick out those details. So let's go and talk about what we're going to use. We're going to use 3 different colors of purple by Applebarrel Paint. We're going to use a very dark purple, which is called Purple Pansy, which is made by Applebarrel Paint right there in the middle. That costs about 50 cents at your local Walmart. We're also going to go with Wild Iris for kind of like a magenta kind of papal purple color that we're going to use. That's also made by Applebarrel Paint, also 50 cents at your local Walmart. And then we're also going to use Lilac Mist, which is also made by Applebarrel Paint. You get that for about 50 cents at your local Walmart. And the reason why we're using 3 different shades of purple is for a couple of reasons. We want to create the idea that yes, they do have purple clothing, but we want to add some variety in the colors that we use, so that way there's some distinction between all the individual fighters. So for example, in the Slangor on the back, we're going to use Wild Iris for its crab claw arm that it actually has on its left arm. For the archer, we're going to use Lilac Mist to pick out the mask fabric of his mask, as well as the pants that he's wearing. And as for the spear person on the right hand side, as well as the leader, we're going to use Purple Pansy in order to pick out their clothing, as well as Lilac Mist for the cloak that the leader is wearing as well. Now we're going to put 2 thin layers of this stuff on there, and once we get done with that, we're going to do another dry brush on that detail. So the color we're going to use in order to dry brush this, of course, is Anita's acrylic. We're using this one color called Wisteria is what it's called. And the reason why we're using that color usually instead of cameo pink is because I wanted more of a lilac kind of dry brushing look on these guys. So I just did that all over the purple fabric that we did earlier. So things like the loin claws, the crab claw, the cloaks that these guys are wearing, their pants, as well as their shirt, as well as fabrics of their mask. We use a quick dry brushing real quick of that color. And then from there, we're ready to move on to the smaller details. So the smaller details we're working on are things like the tassels that these characters are wearing, the hair that they actually have as well as any of the bone elements on these miniatures too. And as you can see, we use actually quite a bit of different colors in order to accomplish this. Now the first thing we did, of course, is that we actually painted the horns of the Slangor in the background there, as well as the blades of the collab collar that character is wearing. We put 2 thin layers of khaki by Applebarrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, and we just kind of painted that directly on there. At the same time, we also used Tuscan Teal as well by Applebarrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. We did things like the mohawk of the helmet, for example, the tassels hanging off of the weapons, the hair of the archer, as well as the spearman in the background as well. And the last thing we did, of course, we picked out the fur tufts around the neck of the collar being worn by the leader, and then we're going to use that with Slate Blue by Anita's Acrylic. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 65 cents. It's a beautiful, cool blue color. I use that color primarily for dry brushing for things like icy bases and that kind of thing. But I just do that real quick around the base of the collar on the neck, and then from there, of course, we're ready to do some dry brushing. So the next color we're going to work real quick is on the fur of the Slangor for this gang. What we're going to do is we're going to pick out the hooves as well as the fur along the legs that this character has. We're going to pick that on 2 thin layers of Burnt Umber by Applebarrel Paint. It's a beautiful dark brown color that you can get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just paint that directly onto the fur as well as the hooves of the Slangor, and then from there we're ready to actually do another dry brush for the different furs on the legs. So to do the dry brushing on the fur of the legs, we're going to use Territorial Beige or Applebarrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just do a quick dry brush on the Slangor's legs. At the same time, I also use the same color to pick out some details on both the leader as well as the Slangor. The Slangor's got like a little bit of a stitched piece of leather on his wrist, so I just picked that out 2 thin layers of Territorial Beige, and same thing with the belt that's crossing the midsection of the warband leader as well. And then when we're done from that, we're ready to do some dry brushing for the tassels. So for the tassels that these characters are wearing, like the mohawk of the leader, the tassels hang off the weapons, the hair of the fighters as well. I picked those out by just doing a quick dry brush real quick with some Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 75 cents at your local Walmart. Same thing with Hobby Lobby. Just did a quick dry brush real quick on all the Tuscan Teal parts that we did earlier, so that way you can see the individual fibers of hair. And once we're done with that little detail, the next thing we can start working on are the metallics for this warband. So we primarily use 3 colors for this entire warband. The first thing we're going to talk about real quick is Anniversary Silver by Folk Art. Now this stuff is a brighter silver, and the nice thing about this color is it's got a little bit of a blue tinge to it, so it looks really nice, and it also contrasts nicely to things like Gunmetal Gray, for example. So we use this color quite a bit throughout the entirety of the warband, and the reason why is because the warband have like these little mirror-looking jewelry pieces that they're wearing. You can see it hanging off of the armor, the shoulder pad of the Slangor. Same thing with the shield of the warrior, as well as the leader's mask, as well as the shield he's wearing, as well as got like this weird like vial thing hooked up to his hip as well. We also got some mirror iconography on the warrior on the right hand side as well as the left hand side. So we picked those out of Two Thin Layers Anniversary Soul to create that kind of semi-mysterious blue tin steel look on these guys' clothing and as well as their armor. Another one we also used too was Gunmetal Gray by Folk Art. You can use this for all the things like the blades of the weapons, for example, the knuckle cut duster on the handle of the sword for the Sangor, for example, the blades of the spear, the arrow tips of the archer, the blade of the spear the character's wearing, as well as some other shoulder pieces as well. And then lastly, for all the gold elements, we're going to use Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. Same thing with the two Folk Art colors, they cost 75 cents as well. And we just pick all the elements that are done in gold. So things like the scroll work on the bow and arrow that the archer's carrying, their face masks of the fighters, the helmet and armor pieces of all the characters. We just pick out all those elements in two thin layers of that Deco Art Emperor's Gold, and then from there we're ready to move on to the fine details that are left. So basically there are two thin pieces of fine detail that we still have to work on these characters, and we're going to talk about that next. The first one, of course, is the jewelry that these guys are wearing, for example. So like I said before, a lot of these guys have gemstones, like on the shield of the leader, for example, off of some of the iconography worn by the Slangor, for example, the archers, as well as the spear person. So all we're going to do is we're going to just pick up those layers in two thin layers of green turquoise by Applebarrel Paint. It's a beautiful, rich green color that kind of looks really nicely, and it contrasts especially with all the gold that these guys are wearing. So it looks really awesome, as well as those little elements that we see in the armor as well. And the last thing we're doing, of course, is to do a little bit with some light mocha by Applebarrel Paint. And we're going to use that for the archer, specifically on the left hand side. He's got like a horn on the side of his head, as well as some of the rods that he has for his arrows. We're just going to put down two thin layers of light mocha, and then from there we're starting working on the base. So for the bases of these miniatures, they're kind of standing on these really cool texturing bases where there's a bit of ruin and masonry that they're standing on, but at the same time, there's a lot of sand on their bases as well, as if they're walking through a desert. And we're going to try to make these guys match up with the rest of the Slaanesh themed miniatures that we have in our Warhammer Studios collection. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick out the masonry in two thin layers of Skyline by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful bluish gray color. I use this a lot from a lot of the Necromunda miniatures, but the reason why I picked this color specifically is so that way if I want to use these guys in Warcry, for example, or in Mordheim, it would kind of fit in that environment as well. From there, we're going to work on the sand texture that's on the bases as well, and I put that down in two thin layers of Concord Gray by Applebarrel Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for about 50 cents as well, and I just put this on all the sand texture that's around the bases as well. And the reason why I've done that is because I have like this very distinctive purplish kind of base look that I use for my Slaanesh army for our Warhammer Studio. If you guys ever seen my battle reports for our Chaos Legion Slaanesh army, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It has got this grayish, bluish, grayish, purplish texture that I do for the bases for that army, and I wanted these guys to match up the rest of the studio's collection. So I just put two thin layers of the Concord Grape on it, and the next thing we're going to do, Crook, is a dry brushing on the bases. So once again, we're using Pale Gray by Folk Art in order to do the texturing on the bases real quick. We just put this as a dry brushing directly on both the sand as well as the masonry that these guys are standing on for their bases to kind of create that texturing. As you can see, we can see the individual grains of sand as well as the like little waving patterns throughout the sand texture. We can see a lot of the individual texturing on the blocks of masonry. And we have one more detail to pick on these bases, and then we will be done with these guys. The last detail we're going to pick out on these bases are the skulls. So you guys can see we have little skulls scattered throughout the texturing on the bases. For that, we're just going to use two thin layers of light mocha by Applebarrel Paint in order to take out those skulls. We just paint them out real quick so that way we can see them. It contrasts nicely with the rest of the texturing. And now that we're done with that final detail, the next thing we got to do, of course, is an oil wash. So this is a quick paint method, meaning that we're using a single oil wash to do the entirety of the washing on these miniatures. And for a lot of people, they like to use Army Painter Strong Tone in order to do that method, which is perfectly fine because Army Painter Strong Tone is a wonderful product that does exactly as advertised. The only problem though is that Army Painter Strong Tone is quite expensive at $32 per can. What I like to use instead is Midwax Poly Shades Emission Oak color, and the reason why is because it does exactly the same thing as the Army Painter Strong Tone, but it costs a fifth of the cost, only costing you $6.99 at your local Walmart. So what we do is, of course, we apply it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature, and the oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is that it seeps into the recesses of the miniatures and brings a lot of the details that we couldn't see earlier. Things like the individual grains of sand on the bases, the texturing of the masonry that these guys are standing on, the folds of the fabric, the crevices of their bodies as well as their musculature, little details that we couldn't see before, things like texturing, for example. They really pop out when we do the oil wash. The second thing that the oil wash also does is it smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing. As you can see, that chalky, dusty appearance is now gone because it smoothed out those transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coats by blending those colors together. And the third thing it also does too, it also reduces the vibrancy of the colors of our miniatures, making them go more of like a mid-range tone with a darker kind of more subdued look, which looks really good, especially when you look at these miniatures as well. Now there is a polyurethane mix inside of the mid-wax, so you do have to wait 24 hours for that stuff to dry and cure. And what it does, you're gonna have a high gloss finish on these miniatures that will also protect it. If you're a fan of that high gloss miniatures, you can skip the next step, which is to put a matte varnish on these guys, but I like my miniatures to have a matte finish whenever I paint them up. So like I said before, the matte spray varnish is completely optional. I like to do it because I like to have a matte finish on my miniatures. I use Krylon matte varnish spray. I get this stuff from my local Walmart for about $5.99, and I just spray them all over the miniature to create that matte look and to get rid of that shine from the high gloss finish. And the last thing I do, of course, I put 2 thin coats of pewter gray of Underworld paint directly on the rim of the bases, so that way it matches the rest of my Slaanesh army that I have in the studio's collection. And as you can see, this is the end result that we showed earlier at the very beginning of the video. And as you can see, we have a beautiful tabletop standards on these miniatures, and they're ready to bring wrath and ruin directly on the fields of battle of Warhammer the Old World, or in my case, I'm using these guys as part of a Mordheim warband. So as you guys can see, this is what the end result would look like. So with that being said, let's talk about the materials that you need to purchase from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results as we did, except using those name brand products instead. Alright, so these are the materials you need to get from Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using these name brand products. You'll need to buy Thunderhawk Blue, Wraithbone, Baneblade Brown, Averland Sunset, Genestealer Purple, Dakala Lilac, Teclis Blue, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylor Brown, as well as Slaanesh Grey, Eshin Grey, Flayed One Flesh, Fulgrim Pink, XV88, Rust Grey, as well as Ulthuan Grey, and each of those paints cost $4.55 a piece. You also need to buy a pot of Asher Granite, as well as Leviathan Purple, Wildwood, Pterodon Turquoise, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Iron Breaker, Aethermatic Blue, Retributor Armor, and all those cost $7.80 per pot. You also need to buy a can of Korax White Spray, which is going to cost you $17, a can of Munitorium Varnish, which is going to cost you $19.50 as well, Army Painter Basing Set for $18.99, as well as Army Painter Strong Tone for $32. Now, assuming that you're buying all those materials for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $216.05 to paint up your warband to look exactly the same way we did, except by using those name brand paints. When you compare that with our Cheapskate total of only $31.67, we're going to help you save $184.38 in order to paint up your miniatures to make them look awesome just like this. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up your warband of the Dread Pageant for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. Your guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this one, you guys. We will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.